Welcome back to Subversive, an exclusive conversation series brought to you by Wasafiri. Each month, we will be in conversation with a poet releasing a new collection in 2025. These poets challenge the limits of the Western lyric and explore living in a turbulent world while holding on to hope. Join us as we discuss their inspiration, politics, writing practice, and more. Today's episode is the last in our series, and it's a pamphlet special. We have Maya Caspari speaking to us about her debut poetry pamphlet, Almost with Tenderness, which I have here, published by Outspoken Press. Maya is a poet and lecturer in the Department of English and Related Literature at the University of York. Her pamphlet, Almost with Tenderness, was published by Outspoken Press in 2025. Her poems have been published widely, and she has been highly commended in the Forward Prizes, shortlisted for the Aesthetica Creative Writing Award, and twice longlisted for the National Poetry Competition. She's associate editor at Wasafiri. Welcome, Maya. It's so great to have you here with us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me. It's really great to be here. Yeah, I'm excited to have a chat.
So, Almost with Tenderness is a pamphlet that reckons with vulnerability, how we are mediated and made through the world around us, through borders, bureaucracies, negotiations with both our families and ourselves. Through it all, these poems make worlds out of fleeting moments. They insist on intimacy, rewire the past, show us the star maps of possibility. So, that was a little bit of me describing your pamphlet. Would you like to describe your pamphlet in 5 words?
I don't know if I'll be able to describe it as well as that. Thank you. What a privilege, especially for such a new poet to have someone read so so generously. Thank you so much. Did you say 5 words?
You can go to 6 if you like. I'm not
Okay.
gonna.
Um, there's a challenge for me as someone who's very indecisive. Um, I don't know if this is gonna give. I think maybe the best thing is like to. This is almost a line from a poem. I think it's 5 words, which is the possibility of touch.
I love
But
that.
four
A
words.
line from a poem that encapsulates the pamphlet. Thank you for that.
I mean,
Um,
there may be more things I don't know, but for me that sort of gets close to something that I was thinking through across the pamphlet, I think.
it's interesting that you said the politics of touch
Or
because, oh,
possibility.
the possibility of touch. Um, because my first question to you was going to be about glass and how so many bodies in the pamphlet are behind certain kinds of glass and therefore cannot be touched or are longing for touch.
Yeah.
So it's a metaphor that's woven through the pamphlet. Glass takes the form of display glass at museums, aquariums, slides under a microscope, all of which speakers observe the world or kind of being observed themselves. And for me, this brings up witnessing, being witnessed, the many kinds of gazes that we have and others bring to our bodies. I'm picking up there was this one line in a poem, Condition, which says, "Sometimes I am behind the glass, sometimes I'm the one who watches." So what did writing through glass, both as material and metaphor, help you access in your work?
Oh, yeah, it's funny because when I was writing, I wasn't really consciously thinking about glass, and early on when someone read it, that was also something they mentioned, that
Mm.
like there was a lot of glass. And it kind of, and then I thought about it and I realized, I was like, oh, that's true. And not that this is a direct influence, but one of my favorite poems is The Glass Essay by Anne Carson. And
Ah, yes.
On my
Sorry, I love Maya
Instagram,
Caspari.
I was like, oh, on my Instagram, I have like this whole random story highlights, which is just about windows. So maybe there's something, so I'm kind of into glass in some ways without having ever noticed. But yeah, so then thinking about it some more, yeah, I think it's a lot to do with what you've just been saying. So obviously, glass has lots of possible, sometimes sort of conflicting associations, I guess. Like you said, there's on the one hand this sense of sort of transparency, access, clarity, not necessarily in my work, but in general. But then on the other hand, you've got, um, the sense of courtness being on display, um, glassiness, something that doesn't, there's not clarity. You've got kind of protection and entrapment. You've got like hardness, fragility, all this
Mm.
stuff, looking glasses. I don't know. Obviously, there are loads of associations, and some of those may be more cliche, but I was interested in that kind of range. And then in my own work, I guess I'm not really sure if I achieve this, but um, I do think when I hope at least that having glass there does kind of create some kind of sense of a boundary or border, which maybe invites a question, like you said, about location or position. So both in terms of like where the speaker is, but perhaps also where the reader is. So even if that kind of location or position isn't a fixed one, like in the poem you mentioned, I hope having this sort of border there makes, might ask questions like, who's looking and where are they looking from? Who's looking at who? Can we reach or touch each other or not? And if not, why not? And I guess those are questions that kind of interest me in different ways. And I guess you could go in like different directions with this. I'm not sure if this is like something I'm doing in my poetry as such, but like certainly it's something I think about. So I guess it's sort of in the background maybe. I think it's interesting to think about questions of sort of access and transparency in relation to poetry. Also, when we think about what, say, a publishing market or a reader might
Mm.
expect, particularly what they might expect from different poets. Like who I guess historically sometimes there's been this sort of expectation. Maybe I'm going off on a bit of a tangent here, but anyway,
No, 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 feel free.
historically there's been a kind of expectation, especially minoritized writers, maybe especially women, um, that their work is somehow like about their life, that it's like this transparent sort of, yeah, like window onto their internal world. Um, or that it should be accessible in a certain way, in a kind of marketable way. Um, and so I think obviously I don't think I'm commenting in any way explicitly on that, but I hope that it's interesting to sort of reflect on like um who who like who who is expected to
Who
be,
gets access to what and
who gets
why?
access to what and why, um, and what are the kind of ethics and politics of those dynamics.
Mm.
Yeah, I think sometimes I am using it in a sense, although I think like as I said at the beginning, it has those multiple associations. So I think there's always the kind of echo of that other possibility. But I think I'm using it often in the sense of, yeah, like being the object of a gaze or being like trapped or being fixed or being looked at as if you're like a specimen
Mm.
in some kind of old museum. And I think that partially emerged from thoughts and research on like ethics around representing the past and especially a kind of violent past. And I was quite kind of influenced by people like um, lots of people, but obviously they're working in very, very different contexts, and I wouldn't claim to be doing anything similar, but like Ariel Aisha Zulay and people like, yeah, her, like, again, in a very different context, obviously, Sadia Hartman, but Hartman talks about the violence of abstraction and this
Mm.
idea that there can be something um, violent in a sense about, yeah, I guess, and kind of objectifying about
Yeah.
right, positioning someone or something in a way which implies that they're just sort of stuck in the past, that they can't move, that all the possibilities of encounter with that moment or that person are kind of being controlled by the one who's representing them. I can probably explain that much better in a minute.
No,
Maybe.
no, that makes sense. I was just as you were speaking, many things came up, but I was thinking of why glass is such a great medium to think this through because not only does it create like border and barrier, it's also something that like refracts, not just reflects.
Yeah.
And it brings a lot about mediation into the
Yeah.
conversation. And as you were talking about poetry and the kind of expectations that are put on minoritized identities, I was thinking about the collaborative essay between Sandeep Parmar and Banu Kapoor called
Mm,
Fourth Space. Was it Fourth Space? Like about lyric
mm,
identity
yes.
and writing. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And actually, you said the word specimen, and the next line that I was kind of thinking about is curation, like specimen divisions between what is the self and other, and this tendency to put oneself in relation to another. But I was thinking a lot about mixedness in your pamphlet, and it was reminding me of Duval's double consciousness. And one poem that I really spent a lot of time with was Horses, which uses racist and xenophobic language to interrogate this the precarious conditions of being accepted as an other of any sort. Um, Many of the poems in the pamphlet explore that mediation and relationality between us and them. But in case of mixedness, I feel like the splitting of the self, and I loved how mixedness was quite relational and slippery and going against the absolutes. So could you speak about writing mixedness or writing through mixedness as a mode a little bit more?
I think I'm interested both in kind of addressing in some way the realities of how things sort of are sort of structured in the world and the kind of ways in which those um, frameworks in which through which we live do affect our experiences. And then at the same time, as you say, I've been well, in fact, I should say, our experiences all in different ways. Um, but yeah, at the same time, as you say, I've been interested in what you just described as the kind of, I guess, the slipperiness of mixed heritage identities, for example. Um, I think so. Maybe one of the first poems that I actually had published, and which is in the pamphlet, is Mixed Other. And at the time that I wrote that, which is now about 5 years ago, or a bit more, I was thinking through the experience of having mixed heritage. So, which in my case was sort of like meant sort of moving through the world, being perceived maybe one way, um, but finding sometimes that that didn't match in a certain way with um, my own sense of self or history, or or at least finding that that kind of sense of other people's perception would change depending on, who I was with, context, and sort of feeling in that way this sense of an identity that's um, in motion, that's moving, that's contingent. Um, and I think I was also thinking or trying to make sense of more generally this feeling, that experience of a kind of I guess the kind of friction between this feeling that not only in maybe in terms of lots of ways, in terms of race, in terms of gender, in terms of
So
in
many
many
intersections. Yeah.
frameworks,
Yeah.
that sense of like, oh, there's a kind of expectation to be, there's a kind of expectation for almost like a kind of smoothness, it felt to me. And just this sense of not ever quite this kind of physical embodied feeling of like, ooh, a kind of slight friction as I was meeting those things.
Mm.
And I'm not saying that anyone can ever perfectly meet those things, but obviously, and in many ways, you know, obviously but obviously it's sort of easier, perhaps, if some people or in some contexts than other people. And, in many ways, it has not always been so difficult in my case, but I was trying to make sense of that kind of build up of feelings of little frictions. So, and I think, and initially I tried to start writing it as an essay, and then a kind of the poem became the only form that would sort of work for thinking it through. And then from that, yeah, I
Can you
guess.
say a little bit why the poem was the best form for it? While you
Um, I think partially it was to do with the, I don't think, not that all essays have to be linear, but I think, there is a kind of certain linearity built into the form of most essays. And I
Mm.
think that poem is one which can be read across or down. So I felt that was a way of um, bringing in partly what I was thinking through about the sense of um, being read in multiple ways, a bit something that can be that kind of changes from
Yeah,
different.
pushing against the either or and having the
Yeah.
contradictions in the same
And just
place.
the room for sort of ambiguity, multiplicity, the kind of role of, the fact that the poem, like poems in general, can, have that, can make meaning through sound, can make meaning through space on the page, have like lots of possible. I kind of, yeah, I think there and in other poems, I suppose I wanted to find a way of allowing for bringing kind of, this sounds a bit pretentious, but bringing kind of those multiple possibilities and to some extent frictions into the space of the I, the
Mm.
speaker, in a way that, and to have to kind of this sense of a location that is sort of a location for the I that is sort of frictional and moving,
Mm.
even while it, um, which I think is harder to do, or I found harder to do in the context of an essay, even, you know, or like at least a more um, an essay, perhaps a more formal essay,
The
certainly kind of
poem,
academic style
like
one.
can collapse time and logic in very interesting ways to be able to do that. And I
Yeah.
was, I was, I think it really did come through that, the speakers in your poems in the pamphlet were really not this homogenized lyric I that sometimes tends to be privileged. And I was also thinking about what it means to love someone or to be, in connection or in relation with someone and all of their contradictions at once. And I was also thinking about things like coalition building, like how do we
Mm.
build relationships with each other while not falling into kind of easy black and white absolutes. Um, yeah, thank
Yeah,
you for that.
thank you. No, that's
Um,
definitely those things that I've definitely been thinking through in in my whether I don't know if it's interesting if it does come through in my poetry also because it's something I think through in the rest of my life.
well, it did come through
Yeah,
because I
that's
thought
quite
about it while
tricky.
reading them. Um,
Yeah, and no, I'm
you
very interested in like relate exactly like moment spaces for solidarity and connection and kinship, I suppose, is maybe the best word for it.
Yeah, frictional kinship,
Especially,
right?
yeah,
Like,
friction and kinship,
I like that word.
especially at the in the current moment.
Yeah.
Um, yeah.
You mentioned sound, which is the next thing that I was gonna ask you about. And I think before you also said that you were trying to bring your speakers out of a past that was fixed and give them more possibility. And for me, something that really came through achieving those things was the way you use sound in the poems. So the poems are very textured with imprints of specters, dead coral, dead loved ones playing Scrabble in the hallway, drinking skimmed milk in the kitchen. I found it really evocative how absence converted to sound. So things like humming, slip song, lines of static, white noise. A sound connects the past and present, but in many ways is both. Like an echo is kind of a very ghostly insistence, and it kind of opens up the poems in very interesting ways. And I wanted to hear more about what writing through sound helped you capture in the work.
Thank you again. Yeah, I think in it again, I don't know if I achieved this, but certainly um a lot of it is, if I in an ideal world, a lot of how I'd like to use sound or what I'd like sound to be doing relates to what you said in the sense of being a way of reinscribing possibility or opening, or multiplying possibility. I guess like, on one level, as we just said, obviously sound adds another layer of possible meaning. Sorry, I got a bit of a cold.
Oh,
Um, to a poem and can kind of complicate. like logical or linear sense making, um, which can be helpful. Um, I think, as you also said, I'm interested in, repetition and sound and what that does sort of in terms of time. So, like you said, it can kind of recall something, it can bring an aspect of the past back, but it also changes it. So it's not, as you, again, like you said, it's not like a kind of necessarily a fixed thing. It's um it's something that's moving, it hopefully in multiple ways. And I think um I guess, yeah, like again, my I don't know how much this kind of comes into the poetry, but my thinking about sound or my feeling about sound have been, I guess, it's just one of those things that has been informed by, lots of other people's work, like listening and reading lots of other poets and thinkers. And maybe this is like not certainly not just critical, um like academics and stuff, but I one thing that I was thinking about, or that comes to mind, is that like um a couple of years ago I did this project which involved kind of putting different thinkers and writers in conversation. And I was like, because I was kind of interested in seeing with my co-editor with Daily, I was interested in seeing like what will happen in these spaces of conversation. And one kind of I was very, very lucky in one conversation to have to be listening into essentially to a conversation between Christina Sharp, um, Francois Bergès, and Higuru Macharia, and they talk in really interesting ways about sound. Um, and like a lot of what they talk about has has really shaped my thinking. Like they talk about the way that we, just why certain sounds or sound patterns in writing of any kind is something that that you remember, that you might hold,
Mm.
or that might hold you, I think in their words. Um, and yeah, I mean, in fact, yeah, Christina Sharp, when we spoke, she hadn't yet published Ordinary Notes, but she was just about to, and she quoted a line from Dion Brandt, who talks about a
Oh,
note
two great
something.
writers, yeah.
I was saying, I think
Sorry.
you can be held and held. So this sense of something that
Mm.
is, um, that has a kind of restorative possibility. And they also talk about it in the sense of like, as we were just saying, how it can carry, so how it's creating possibilities. It's located initially in a single moment, but it's also sort of changing and moving onwards and onwards and potentially reaching other people. So there's a kind of tactile relational aspect to it also. And yeah, so when I was thinking, like, obviously I wasn't like necessarily
Yeah,
actively,
because it's the phrase echoing through time, right?
yeah,
And now that I'm talking about it, sound and time are very connected.
yeah,
And
I
your
think,
poems are very non-linear in that kind of way. They're very
yeah. But I probably wasn't thinking about all that. I mean, when I was like, we were talking about um spaces, relation, and kinship, and there's that one poem about notes towards the definition of kinship, and I was just thinking about like little moments of kinship or joy, and I was thinking, although not that the poems are like strictly autobiographical, but I was just then thinking, for example, about someone like my brother laughing, and that is like, and the kind of excess of those sorts of moments, and the kind of joy of those sorts of memories as well. So maybe a
And it's
bit.
that kind of thing, like sometimes you're having a bad day and you're walking down the street, and then like a laugh will come back from a memory
Yeah,
and just make you feel a
exactly.
little bit better.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
I remember this one line from one of the poem you just mentioned, Notes Towards the Definition of Kinship, a body's grammar tending to another place. And it's one of my favorite lines
Oh,
in the collection. Um, did you want to say a little bit more about writing time in your poems, because it's just quite connected, actually, sound and time. And I was really struck by how non-linear your poems were, as you've already said. And I think that I personally, when I write a poem, I like to end on like a resolution. But for me, what was really it really opened up possibilities for me reading your work because in a way your poems end on quiet moments or quiet touches, hushes. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about whether you were thinking about time um, as you wrote these poems and how to kind of contract or extend it.
Yeah, I'm kind of geeky about things like tenses and grammar. So yeah, that is probably something I was more actively thinking about.
Yeah,
Uh,
because so many of the poems, even the titles, have a lot of there's mixed conditional, there's past continuous.
yeah.
Yes, I will let you
Yeah,
speak.
yeah. Like I said, I'm kind of into the into the tenses. Because I was um interested in, yeah, like what it means to think through um the past in different ways, or like what it means, not only the past, I suppose, but like when we talk about someone else or something that's happening in the world, what are the effects of different grammars? Obviously now we're seeing rightly critique of news organizations using the passive voice to say
Yes,
people have died, when actually in a way that obscures who is
who is
living,
doing the yeah.
right? And so that's not an exact example, but basically I'm quite interested in the, in the effects that those choices of language can have. Um,
Mm.
and again, I not and going back to poetry, it's not that I think that there's anything inherently like good about. I think you have to be careful not to be like anti-linearity is like inherently right, but I do find myself sort of drawn to things that feel a bit less resolved. And I think it goes back to what we've been saying about liking to like trying to retain different possibilities for the speaker. And maybe for like what happens when the reader meets the poem as well. Although I think, of course, every poem in its way has those possibilities, but however, even if it feels more resolved, because you never quite know what's going to happen when someone meets it. But I think for me, it's kind of important to try to, especially when writing about the past, um, partly because sometimes it reflects a general sense of you're slightly fictionalizing, you're working with pasts where things have been obscured or lost, you don't really know what's happened. So there's a certain actual uncertainty built into it,
Mm.
but also kind of, um, I guess this again kind of maybe relates to some of my um, other like academic work, which is partially on touch.
Mm.
Again, sorry if this is a bit tangential.
No, no.
But for me, when I'm thinking about touch, it's very much connected to time. So I think a lot about, like what could happen, good or bad, at any particular moment of encounter, including, for example, my encounter in the present with materials from the past or a person from the past. Like how might something change in terms of like, might I be moved by it, or my perspective, or or even physically, like if I'm holding an old photograph or an archival document, is there gonna be a kind of fraying of that? Is it gonna wear down? So in all kind of both, I guess, like emotional and like physical and like multiple ways, I'm interested in like the potential for things slightly moving or changing at moments of encounter. And both like encounters between people in the poem, but perhaps ultimately also, when thinking about it in terms of poetry, sorry, you might think about encounters between people or things in the poem, but also, and the speaker's encounter with the past, but also perhaps like how might a reader meet this also?
Yeah.
So I kind of want that to be a moment of possibility. In another of the interview series or the kind of conversation series I mentioned earlier, another of those was with, I don't know, sorry, I haven't got into like mentioning all these academics when I'm actually also like end up thinking a lot about poets. But anyway, that's
But
clearly
no, please go ahead.
my mood this morning. But like, yeah, another of those said is with Ariella, two people, Ariella Aisha Zula and Lisa Lowe, and they, in very different contexts, both write about, um, I suppose, what they see as the ethical and political dangers of writing about the past, especially past violence, in a way that makes it seem like it's something that is like over there, like totally over, totally fixed, because well, obviously the past is in a sense over, but like for them, it's important to think about, especially if there's a kind of, like a particular official narrative about what's happened. It can be, they suggest, I don't know, somewhat important or even liberatory. And again, I'm not making a claim for doing this. I'm just saying this is something that interested me.
Mm.
It can be important to think about the kind of what could have happened,
Yeah.
not to create like a total counter history, but just to imagine possibilities that may have either been forgotten or even foreclosed at the time.
Yeah.
Um, and to kind of remember the kind of ongoing effects of what's happened in the present. And so yeah, that's for Ariella Aisha Zulay calls that potential history, and Lisa Lowe has a similar context kind of concept which she calls the past conditional. I think
Right.
past conditional, which
Mm.
or something like that. I can't remember. I'll have to find it. Which yeah. I was sort of thinking through similar things, and then I came across their work, and I was like, ah, okay.
Yeah. Um, yeah, I feel like when so many things around us and history and all of these forces follow very linear logics or have been structured, let's say, to follow linear logics. I
Mhm.
feel like what happens when we're anti-accumulation? What happens when we're so many things like emotion, like grief, joy, pain, all of these are circular, they come back in different ways. So I'm really hearing what you're saying. And kind of it also was, I was also thinking about what gets framed as productive, right? When
Yes.
things are linear. And if they're not going towards some kind of resolution, are they then unproductive? I'm just like, yes, I will be unproductive all day. And one of those
Absolutely.
things is like remembrance, care, kinship, when they're not kind of step A to B to C and not accumulating, it kind of opens up a whole other framework of
Yeah.
just love.
Yeah,
Um,
absolutely. I think, yeah, exactly that. There is definitely that thing of like, oh, you need to be this productive individual who's progressing. And then, of course, you've also got all those, the idea of the kind of
yeah,
progress.
it's like, no, I will spend 1 week in this memory, actually.
Yeah, and it's like, nah. Yeah,
Um,
I'm definitely doing something really important here.
I'm having nostalgia. Um,
Yeah.
speaking of non-linear questions, I was gonna ask,
This is just how I justify my general, like, chaotic, messy state, I think.
but maybe that's the best way
Extended
to,
justification.
there's no justification required. This should
Like,
just
I need
be,
to find an academic justification for this, yeah.
yeah, because then you can be like, this person said it, and I love this person's work, so therefore I'm
Exactly, yeah.
allowed. Yeah,
They
yeah,
said it, it's all okay.
yeah. But yeah, in terms of a non-linear question, I was gonna ask, you're a lecturer and researcher in your wider practice. How did you make your way to poetry? And is there, I mean, you've actually answered this a lot. There's a lot of cross-pollination, but I'm just interested in how your journey towards poetry.
Cool. Um, well, I guess I've like always written poetry, but I didn't really think about I don't know, somehow like I I think I was kind of scared to do what felt like taking a risk of like, trying it out in a sense of like actually submitting it to places. Um, and some part of me felt like I don't know why, but there was some part of me that was like, I need to, show that I can do, I don't know who I'm showing, but I need to show I can like do this like academic thing first, and then I'm allowed
Right.
to do it, like to start doing it. So um although I'd always been writing alongside, and since my work in academia is in English, I had been thinking a lot about creative writing, other people's work. It was only when I finished my PhD that I was like, Okay, like now I'm allowed to
Not
like
you're allowed.
to give it a little bit of a go.
I
And to
think there's something really interesting there in how both in terms of knowledge production and in terms of so like pedagogy and epistemology both, like poetry is not considered real or serious,
Mm,
when in fact it contains so much.
yeah. And I think it's funny because on one level I'd never obviously I do think that it's especially now and I'm biased, but of course I have always respected it. But then some level, emotionally it was sort of hard for me to maybe, it was sort of hard for me um to do that. And I think also maybe because just there's something vulnerable anyway about, like trying to also, there's the aspect of just it being kind of like slightly scary. But you're right. I think it's also about how things are sort of respected or how things are seen, different modes of writing are seen and and rewarded in different, both like socially, materially, etc. And like, yeah, so I started writing, in the sense of like submitting and stuff. Um, you know, in some ways, like yeah, a bit later than maybe I could have. Um, in that I was writing for myself before. And then I've been very lucky just to have like um as well as having some publications, just to like have encountered some like amazing poets and people like, colleagues and mentors and friends. And that's I think is maybe a cliche, but like although I knew in theory, like until I started really kind of trying to write poetry more properly, I kind of hadn't fully grasped just like how important that kind of community of people really is. And yeah, so I think that and that process of like having, yeah, like met other poets and editors and mentors and then done a couple of I was lucky enough to be able to do a couple of courses where I met people. Those sorts of things have just like been really transformative and yeah, so I'm very grateful to everyone in that world. But yeah, and just
And
more
they're very
generally,
grateful for you too.
who knows? But like, I hope so. Like, I would hope to try and like put, people have been so generous that if I can, I will want to sort of to try to be that way, where I
It's a
can.
very mushroom-like ecosystem, I think,
Mm.
where we're just all kind of constantly in conversation with each other in
Yeah,
many different ways. Yeah.
yeah, I think that's true. But yeah, like I've said, more generally, there's definitely like an overlap between my what I'm thinking through in academic terms and the poetry. And in some another reason that I think I started writing poetry was a bit like I was saying with that mixed other poem. In some ways, I felt, um, although I think academic writing, some people do it in very flexible, creative ways. It's not. I think I sometimes just felt though, maybe especially at like an early stage where it's harder to be like, I'm going to do something wild with this academic piece. Um, I felt kind of like actually some of the research I was doing, which is on touch, which was on the ethics of representing historical violence. Part of the research I was doing, I was thinking about how writers themselves who were thinking through these issues, and part of that was often about reflecting how they were touched by what they were working with and thinking about their own location and position. And I began to feel kind of like the slight friction, if you like, again, or the slight complication of some of the kind of academic the academic place, the voice I was inhabiting and what I was writing about. And I felt that poetry, so there was also a kind of way in which I felt that poetry was as a form was a more helpful way of, if that's the right word, a more generative way of thinking through and writing about some of the things I wanted to. So yeah, it's a kind of another way of thinking things through for me. But I don't like actively. I feel like as I said, like I've referenced like various academic things in this, maybe because I'm writing an academic book at the moment. But I it's not like I sit down and think about that stuff actively. I think it's just sort of
I think
naturally
it filters through.
filters through in some way. Yeah, I don't know how you find that yourself.
Um, I think it's all enmeshed, really. And I think
Yeah.
poetry is a very generous form and medium
Yeah.
to explore some of these things. Um, one, no, two more questions. I'm actually just going to ask, how did you decide the title of your pamphlet?
Oh, I had a lot of trouble deciding the title because I have a lot of trouble deciding everything. Um, and also that's like an especially tricky decision. So I went through quite a few different versions. I knew I wanted it to be something to do with like contingency and perhaps like almostness.
Condition.
Yeah, like something that's not quite fixed. And then, but it was hard to find a good way to do that. And then, I was looking through lines, and I have to thank actually my mentor, one of my mentors, um, Anthony Vanni Capildeo, who found that line and was like suggested it. So maybe it's not very good, but I who read
No,
through
I
the
think it's perfect for this pamphlet,
but
which
and
is
I felt like it worked because it had that sense of almostness, and I think um the I like the kind of tenderness aspect also, in terms of relating perhaps to some of what I've been saying or what we've been discussing about writing with a care or thinking about questions of relation also.
Thank you. Um, Before I ask you to read a poem for us, could you give us three literature or media recommendations to take away? You've given us some already, but maybe just list
Yeah,
them again.
I kind of been judging this.
Oh no, you can give more than three if that's helpful.
Again, as I mentioned, I'm like very indecisive, so it's like, and I feel like my memory is really bad, so like I feel um either I give like I can't think of anything or I think of like 100 things. I mean maybe since maybe I will just use like some of what we've been discussing because I think otherwise the net is like
It's very
really
wide. Yeah.
wide because I'm reading so many brilliant things. So what have we been discussing?
It was
Uh,
Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes. I
yes,
think.
Christina Sharp's Ordinary Notes would be a good one. Yeah, for sure. Or and anything by Dion Brandt, who she mentions. Yeah, Ordinary Notes, maybe a bit, maybe I'm sure lots of people will have read it, but I think that's really interesting in terms of how it's, well, in lots of ways. But we talked about sound and in terms of what it's doing with like genre and form. Um, who else did we talk about? We talked about Anne Carson at the beginning in the glass essay.
Yes.
Um,
And
uh,
Carson has come up in three of these interviews, actually. So
really?
just a testament
Oh
to the
no.
Universal and Carson fan club.
Oh dear. Maybe I should find something else then. But
No, no,
yeah.
no, 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 no. I love it. And it's all been different works by her as well. So
I'm sure I'm gonna, yes. Well, I mean, I could say, I mean, the glass essay in itself, since that's what I've mentioned, I've also just been revisiting um autobiography of Red.
of Red. Oh, one of
Um,
my favorites.
I I actually came to Anne Carson quite late. A friend of mine worked a lot on Anne Carson, and I read only as it seems to be, as you said, like a something that lots of poets like. She's her work, and I for a long time I don't know why I just had like it took me a long time to get there, and then when I did, I was like, oh, now I see. Um, and then I don't know if we've mentioned other people, but like I mean, I'm reading loads of brilliant collections at the moment, and also I guess we've been talking about pamphlets. I feel it's very, pamphlets don't often get that much
Attention.
attention, and so I think I would like to make a little plug for the pamphlet as a form and for I can't mention everybody, but like lots of friends and colleagues and poets have obviously other poets have published some really, really great pamphlets lately in the last couple of years. So this isn't really a specific recommendation, but I want to make a little
Pamphlet love. I'm
plea
here
for
for the pamphlet
remembering the
fart, to be
pamphlet as a
honest.
form.
Yeah.
And and yeah, as I said, I kind of almost don't want to start listing because I feel like I'll miss one out. Although actually, like my publisher Outspoken also recently published a pamphlet um, by um, a young poet from Gaza called The Age of Olive Trees by Haya Muhammad. So I think, and so um, yeah, if I'm gonna choose one pamphlet, I'll highlight that one.
Okay. Thank you. Would you like to read us a poem to close us out?
You don't have any preferences to
Maybe
how?
we can decide right now.
I quite like olives in the sense that it's like
I love that. It's the one after
weird,
Natalie
although it's
Diaz.
quite long. I don't know if it really relates to what we've actually been talking about though.
No, I think so. I think you could read Olives if you would like.
But there are other, or I could read the one about kinship, although it's maybe less of a um maybe it's better on the page. I don't know.
Do you want to experiment with
Yeah.
the kinship one?
What do you prefer?
Oh, that's a hard question.
Sorry.
I'm a fan of olives. So if you
Okay,
want to
let's
read
do
olives.
olives. Let's do olives. I think it doesn't necessarily relate that I'll just say, it's like slightly different from some of the ones we talked about, but I like it so. Okay, and it's after Natalie Diaz, who would have been another person I could have added to my list of recommendations. Olives. We threw a party for my sister. On this occasion, I was smiling. To begin, my parents bought several giant jars of green olives, my sister's favourite, and made small piles of olives by the door, one for each year of her life. In addition to this, my brother added empty pick and mix bags to the table, almost like the ones we had when we were taken to see films as young children and we played the game, cramming all the sweets into our mouths so that we couldn't speak. We wrote out words from my sister's recent WhatsApps into choir books. Guests arrived. My brother led my aunts and uncles in an a cappella harmony. I'm fine. Everything is great. See you very soon. See you. These were the kind of things she said, and to reflect their subtle dissonance, my aunts and uncles swayed from side to side at random times, looking confused and sometimes bumping into one another. There were no real children at the party. Still, we hung strips of packaging from the online shops my sister liked, cut into bright, abstract shapes, or shredded like flaccid mop tendrils from the ceiling, like the aftermath of an accident with a piñata filled with stones. It's a great game, we told anyone who asked, while refusing to explain the rules. My sister's childhood books were buried in the garden, along with tiny parts of each of our tongues. In the main room, we cross-hatched wires over the walls, with signs like, "Smile, you're on camera," to make my sister feel at home if she arrived. Though when one neat-haired man applauded, saying, "She must like him, or she would have left by now," we knew we had to lead him gently to the open garden door, the dampened soil. Later, some friends stopped by and made speeches about my sister and her well-known sweetness, which we toasted with tall glasses of fruit punch. We did not speak about her husband or why she'd not been able to come to the party. Instead, we practiced Morse code with her friends. When I later wrote to my sister about the party, she said, "That did not happen," to which I replied, "Two can play that game." My sister did not respond to this immediately, but some weeks later wrote to thank us. She would visit very soon, she said, as she always did. She was sorry it had been so long. Everything was fine. She would come back very soon, and she would bring us many jars of green olives.
Thank you so much, Maya, for the poem and for this lovely conversation.
Thank you, and thank you so much for such generous questions and conversation. And I'm sorry, I
Of
think you might need to do some editing.